Good evening and welcome to this webinar tonight, sponsored by the R.H. Boyd Publishing Company, along with our Vision Conference, our President and CEO, Sister LaDonna Boyd. And we certainly appreciate your gathering with us on tonight to have a very pointed conversation about multi generational pastoral leadership with strategic vision. We have two of our nation's premier leaders and organizers, thought leaders, influencers in Christendom. The elder Mark Moore, who provides leadership for the Young Leaders Conference, an incredible engagement of young people that deals with media ministry, marketing in the marketplace. Just a phenomenal young man. We're happy to have him sharing, and we'll allow him to introduce himself in just a minute. And then we certainly thank God for Pastor Ralph West, the Church Without Walls, there in Houston, Texas. And his reputation certainly precedes him coast to coast. And we're just glad to have him sharing with us on this evening for this conversation, multi generational pastoral uh, leadership with strategic vision is what we want to kind of discuss tonight. Elder Moore, you want to do a little personal invitation of who you are, your ministry, where you're located, and those types of things.
Yes, sir. Let me begin by saying that it is truly an honor to be here at the Vision Conference tonight, and certainly thank you to Ms. team that has assembled this just phenomenal lineup. I'm sitting here looking at Dr. West, and I feel like a nurse at a doctor's convention. But nevertheless, I'm a young man that loves God, and we had an idea to host an event a few years ago to assemble a generation around those three pillars of ministry and media in the marketplace. And little did we know that in the span of just a few years, it would grow from 50 people in the meeting room of a DoubleTree to over 5,000 in the convention center. And just last year alone, God has been faithful to us. And last year, He allowed us to pay off over $2 million worth of medical debt for those facing foreclosure and bankruptcy. We were able to host 5 presidential candidates, and in addition to them, Reverend Al Sharpton and Congressman John Lewis and so many others. And we're really just committed to making a difference and bridging a gap between generations. I'm currently in Atlanta, Georgia, where I assist my father in ministry, and I am proud to say that I'm a 5th generation preacher's kid. And so I'm just excited to contribute and be a part of this conversation.
Very good. Thank you so much, and congratulations for all that God is using you to do to impact the kingdom.
Thank
All
you.
right, Pastor West.
Ralph Douglas West, the senior pastor at Church Without Walls in Houston, Texas.
And you organize that church, right, Ralph?
I am the founding organizing pastor 32 years ago, 33 years this November.
All right. And you started with a small group in your home, I understand.
Yeah, we began with 32 people, and now church is probably an active membership of 13,000, maybe no more than that, but 13,000 people.
That's great. Man, listen, God is faithful and He's kind, and He has certainly richly blessed you. And I know you personally, and I understand how responsible you've been with the rich blessings that God has placed in your care and in your child. We're challenged tonight to have a very engaging conversation about multi generational pastoral leadership. And so, multi generational, and I believe probably over the last uh, 5, 7 years, there's been great dialogue and discussion around how do we engage the younger generation, the millennials, the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. I think most churches and ministries and organizations are challenged with reaching and engaging and incorporating that younger demographic um, in their organizations or their churches or their ministries. And most churches and our listening audience is probably made up of pastors that pastor in a wide variety of congregational contexts, probably dealing with three or four generations in a particular community of faith, and certainly in the residential communities, you have multiple generations. And so, what what tools, what tips, what wisdoms can the two of you share about how to even engage with multiple generations? How to speak to multiple generations either simultaneously, or how do you target one in order to get them engaged?
I'm interested to hear you, Mark, respond to that.
We have a lot in common because I was interested in hearing you respond as well. Species that the world has never seen, when in reality, millennials are people. And there are some symptoms, some mindsets, some tendencies that are common to man across generational lines. We tend to suggest that millennials need some kind of uh, uh, different approach in ministry. And while every generation requires innovation and understanding, I think that it's important that we keep in mind that if we're going to have a multi-generation conversation, we have to identify the common thread that both sides of the spectrum have. Millennials, just like our parents, just like our grandparents, just like our children, some millennials will be grandparents in a minute. Uh, and I think it's important that all of those generations are understood, and it's understood that they all want to be respected. They all want to feel heard, and they all want to feel that their voices have some degree of validity. And so, what we do, and I'm speaking from my standpoint, what we do with our conference, for example, it is a young leaders conference, but part of the favor that God has placed on it is that we have people that have come literally from every demographic. We have our oldest registrant last year, I believe, was 78 years old, and she had her granddaughter register her. She was the only person that mailed in a check for her registration. But she said, I want to come so I can learn how to work the Twitter better. And she, just like our 18-year-olds, there's some things that everybody wants. Everybody wants to feel heard. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to feel that their voice and their view matters. And so if we're going to have real intergenerational, multi-generational conversation and ministry, we have to put weight and value on every side of the equation. We cannot become so focused on getting young people in, as essential as they are, that we push out and alienate our parents and our grandparents. And at the same time, we cannot be so consumed with keeping one older generation happy that we do nothing to speak to the needs of a younger upcoming generation, which will be the future and arguably is the very present of our church.
Okay. All right, Pastor West.
No, I appreciate that. I really appreciate the emphasis on the term millennial, which is a term that I don't use in our congregation. Um, the way that I approach multi-generational church is, and my emphasis is always on proclamation. When I read through the scriptures and see how Jesus speaks to these multitudes of people, I never hear him identify and categorize who the people, or categoricalize the people that gather in the, as one translate, the multitudes of people, multi-generation. He addresses them by truth. And what I've learned over the years is that truth is relevant and truth is generational and multi-generational. I still carry a large amount of people that you would call young adults, or in this case, millennial, Gen X's, whatever you call them. And they still come to that church. And when people ask them, Pastor West is older now. Why do you go to that church? As if, because on one hand, you have people that criticize being millennial, then you have another group that criticize age. I always tell them just keep on living. And, but truth for me has always been the connectivity to reach multitudes or multi-generations of people. And so I don't have a very sophisticated way of articulating that. That is how I preach. And I mention preaching because everything that I do in my church, whether it is developing children, youth, young adults, singles, adults, married, all of it is born out of my preaching. All of it is born out of preaching, from building projects to standing up for a social justice movement. It all is born out of my preaching. So I appreciate Mark making that, clarifying that, because I too find it kind of disdaining that you would stand up and identify one group of people as if nobody else in the congregation matters.
Yes, sir.
So
I think that's an incredible insight and wisdom for those persons that are listening. And even though you may not verbally single them out, but in the proclamation of the word or the teaching, how do you utilize illustrations, applications that cut across generational lines that everybody feels like, as Mark said, you're talking to me, you're sensitive to my stage and status in life.
well, again, one of the ways that I do it is if it's illustrative material, it just depends on what the biblical text that's under investigation is promoting. Because I don't ever want an illustration to overshadow the integrity of interpreting a biblical text. That's number one.
Okay.
I think that the strength, as you talk about application, now that's a place where you can really bear down to speak to multi generations. And the way that I do it, unless I'm invited to speak to a specific group of people, and that is the target audience.
Okay.
On a Sunday morning, my application always includes something for men, something for women. I'm always mindful of singles, single mothers, children. And so let's just take prayer. If you just say something on prayer. And then I'll say, instead of just a nebulous statement of, and we all ought to pray, to men, here is a way that you can pray. And sisters, here's a way that you can go about praying during this time. And let me say a special word to my students.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a challenge in praying, how about every time the bell rings on the hour to change classes, you whisper a sentence prayer? And parents, how about a time where you sit down and pray before your children?
Mm-hmm.
Auto pray. I'm just going down the line.
Right.
So that allows me to connect with everybody in the congregation. I'm very mindful of that. It's very intentional when I'm doing that for those points of application and to include everybody. And I just start naming people in there. So, depending on how many movements a sermon of mine may have, I'll start addressing in different movements, different aspects of people within the crowd. I think that's one of the ways that you could do it.
That's great. Uh, uh, Elder Moore, in your Young Leaders Conference, you said that last year, I believe, your oldest registrant and participant was, I think you said 78,
Yes, sir.
and she wanted to know how to utilize Twitter
Yes, sir.
better.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that, as we talk about leadership, I believe it was John Maxwell who says leadership is influence. And
Mhm.
so, if we're talking about multi generational leadership, what do you utilize to influence a person who is 78 and then influence a person who's 18 to respond to uh, tools and techniques that you know would allow them to be more engaged in this current culture?
That's an exceptional question, and I think that the is really simple in my perspective. Programming and even our marketing approach is we understand that you cannot fight fruit. And by that, what we mean is results are something that cannot be denied, regardless of the age group that the person looking in might belong to. And so, what we try to do instead of pushing personality, we try to make sure that the fruit, the evidence, the testimonials are clear and present, so that anybody can look and say that might be a young man, but what he's doing works. And I think that in the conversation around influence, if we would focus on collectively, if we would focus on managing and honestly stewarding the current influence that we have today, I'm a believer that nothing produces influence tomorrow like the proper use of your influence today.
Hmm.
And so, if we can continue to promote, pulling on what Dr. West said, the truth and the evidence of whatever it is that we're trying to present, whether it be our ministry, whether it be our businesses, whether it be our services, there are a wide range of people that are connected to this platform, whether you're an entrepreneur, whatever you do, if you can put the fruit out there, you might not like the personality, but you can't fight fruit. You might not understand all of the technology or the style or the full presentation, but results are results. And let's get back to remembering and emphasizing that everybody is looking for results. And so, if you have found a way to key in on something that works, you have to not push you, not push your personality, not push your style and your outfit and your personal charisma. Learn how to push the fruit, and people that are looking for fruit will find it. People that are looking for results, people that are looking for something that is proven, people that are looking for truth will find it if they know that they can trust you, and if you can show that what you have in fact works. So that's really been the key for us, Dr. Do, pushing the fruit, pushing the
That's
fruit.
a great response because that's what influences people, the results,
Yes, sir.
and so the results that you've gained from your conference, the responses, the testimonies,
Mhm.
it's almost like the word of mouth kind of
Yeah,
advertising.
absolutely.
A person who has attended and has been impacted by your ministry and then goes out and tells someone else, that then becomes the influence. Almost like Paul told one of the churches, "You are my epistle, you are my
Absolutely.
letter." And
Absolutely.
so go influence others to hear the gospel.
Yes, sir.
Um, uh, Pastor West, you want to kind of speak to that influence piece and how do you influence multiple generations? Because you talked about prayer, but if you're dealing with a building project or you're dealing with responding to or participating in the Black Lives Matter movement, how would you influence multiple generations to come alongside, the vision that God has given you for the community there in Houston and the church without walls?
Yeah, yeah. since uh, since protest is one of the hot button issues that's happening today, and I want my people to be engaged in protest, in responsible protest. But their friends from other very conservative backgrounds say there's no place for protest in the church. The church shouldn't be involved. Then you sit down and you say, well, they probably have never read carefully the scriptures.
Yeah.
Uh, Each time God put on a huge demonstration, it was when words stopped working. He put on a demonstration.
Yeah, he did.
The aristocrat Isaiah, yes. I mean, this is a priestly prophet who walks around naked and barefooted for 3 years to demonstrate what God's going to do to Israel. Or Jeremiah, who walks around in a loincloth. And then he goes down to the potter's house and he buys this expensive piece of earthenware and smashes it and says that this is what God is going to do to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Or you go back with him with his diaper on and burying it at the Euphrates and pulling it back. Becomes a demonstration of the 70 years that they would spend in exile. And when they're brought back, they'll be dingy and dirty and all of that, but the remnant will be redeemed. Or Hosea is put on a demonstration by Mary Gomer. So if I'm challenging my people to get involved in the protest,
Yeah,
then I want them to know that they belong to a long tradition of prophets
Yeah.
who protested long before they were called to protest. Now, somebody listening says, that's proof texting. No, that ain't proof texting. If you understand what was happening, you look at how words stop working. God has spoken, and when they stop hearing, he says, well, I'll consign them to their own catastrophe. And he put on a demonstration. This is Ezekiel,
Mhm.
summer thunderstorm, where he begins to see a vision, and then he puts on these demonstrations. So again, the way that I go about doing it, if I want to, and that's influence them to do it, I want them to participate in a proper way. They want to be Christian, they want to be biblical, and I say you stand in the line of a great tradition of people that put on a demonstration. Well, then let's go to the other spectrum. You want to build a building, and so you say, I once uh, preached a sermon on a building project on why not build. Why not build? And I gave all the reasons why we ought to not build from Genesis 11. Everything about that
yeah,
building project
yeah,
was wrong. It was the wrong location, the wrong station, the wrong mission, the wrong intention. And
yeah, just
just
wrong.
line. And then after that, I follow up with a series of the Psalm of Ascents, where we're ascending up to what God wants us to build. So you get a chance to say, now you can make up your mind after you hear these sermons, which becomes one of the domains out of which we preach institutional preaching. And so, and they can make up their own mind. So again, the way that I want to influence the generation
Mhm.
is I want to give them and say, this is the foundation that we work with.
Yeah.
The Bible is our biblical blueprint, and it causes us to be engaged in the totality of life and living. That there's no aspect of life that we're not involved in. Individual, personal, cultural, psychological, every aspect of our life is addressed in that. People don't have to accept it, but the way that you influence it is say, I'm going to preach it, and I'm going to preach it with integrity too. I'm not going to press hard and say that the text is saying something that it's not saying, because I want them with integrity to rise up and say, this is why we built, this is why we participate in missions, this
Yeah.
is why we do evangelism, here's why we give to the poor, this is why we give a certain percentage of our money to a corporate program to address hospitalization and give money to school. All of that is born out of it. So I think for me, again, I'm speaking just for me, for those that are listening, of how I influence is always out of my preaching. Everything is out of my preaching. Everything is out of it.
So then, what you're really saying is you utilize
Utilize
divine influence or the influence that comes out of the Word of God. That's sharper than any two-edged sword. That can cut to the soul and heart of a man and really penetrate his mind, transform his thoughts and heart, and then I guess magnetically draw him into what Michael Quick would call God's big story, and allow him to play out his role or her role or their role in God's big story. And so, yes, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I would say it. I probably wouldn't spiritualize it that much.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I probably would not spiritualize it that far. I agree. I know what you mean. But at the same time that I want them to come to a conclusion, I want them to see that there is a historical, grammatical, and theological persuasion that we are part of, as you mentioned, quick, the meta narrative. That
Yeah.
this narrative is not absent of people being participants to make a change in the world. Because I'm real big on that. I think that Jesus' metaphors of salt and light,
Yeah.
which really you're talking about a great passage for influence.
Mhm.
That is an influence passage where you sit down and who do I want really involved in whatever these protests are? I'm just using that word.
Right.
Who wanting this influence? I want the young men and young women in my church who are 15, 16, 17 on their way to college, becoming credentialed, coming back home, getting jobs, getting involved in the world. That's what I want. I want to see that, I want to see that. And so we are championing that cause to say, come join the larger fraternity and say, let's make a difference in the world.
I like that language, the larger fraternity. In your leadership conference, Young Leaders Conference, um, what are some of the premier principles that you want young people to take away from that's a part of where you're leading them and where you're influencing them?
You know, one that I think I want to emphasize really points back to the founding scripture that led me to really start the conference, and ironically, it comes out of Malachi. Typically, you get a bunch of preachers in the room who talk about Malachi. First thing that comes to mind is, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me." How? Tithing and offering. But that's not all it says. It goes on and talks about the fact that in the last days, he says, "I will send my prophet, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons, hearts of the sons to the fathers." And then the next verse says, "Lest I smite the earth with a curse." Uh, what I felt at the time we started was that my generation was not seeing this turning of hearts that scripture talked about. For whatever reason, and of course, this is impacted by what circle you belong to, but there's so much chatter, at least on my end of the age spectrum, about how the proverbial fathers are holding us back. And so many young voices feel that they're being held back, and their spiritual fathers and pastors are all stalled, or rather, they're trying to destroy them and trying to keep them from being great, and they're jealous of them. And I'm looking at the landscape, and it just became so clear to me that what our generation needed was a turning of hearts to the sons and the fathers, and especially that follow-up verse that speaks about essentially, if this turning does not take place, God says, "I'm essentially going to smite the earth with a curse." And I looked at the church world, I looked at our natural world, and I felt that some of what we're dealing with, in part, was the curse that resulted from this facilitation of hearts not taking place. And so I said that to say that part of what we attempt to do at the conference is we try to promote what I believe is a biblical narrative that intergenerational ministry is God's idea. We try to present the idea in a very visible way that it does not have to be a war between methods. It does not have to be a war between generations. It does not have to be either or. It can be both and. And so that looks like this. You'll come into a service at my conference, and it'll be 5,000 people. We're bringing extra chairs in. There's a 90-foot LED wall. There's a band on 2 stories. There are lasers and lights and all of that. But when you get in there, a choir's going to march into that choir stand, and they're going to sing a hymn before the night is over. What is that? That's intergenerational. So when you look at the audience, you have a young man with skinny jeans on and Jordans. He's got his knees cut out on his jeans. He's got a baseball hat on. Next to him, though, you got a brother in a 3-piece suit, a Hickey Freeman suit. Next to him, you got a sister with a hat with rhinestones on it. And so it creates a hybrid in the room. And the takeaway that I want people to have is that there is value in both generations. There's value in both ways. And God is not limited by our interpretations of style. He's not boxed in by our particular generational preferences. He's bigger than that, and he can move in more than one way. So one of the key elements from a spiritual side that I want our people that come to leave with is that God is bigger than just the era that we found him in. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But he's also the God that said, behold, I will do a new thing. Now shall it spring forth. And so I think that if we're going to see real revival, and if we're really going to reach our cities, really win the lost, we have to make sure we understand that God is bigger than just our style and our preferences. And so that's one of the main takeaways that I want our people to leave with. And I think part of that comes from the fact, again, that I'm a fifth generation preacher's kid. So I was born on the front row with a suit on Easter, basically. So I have a heart for the sights and the sounds of the traditional church. But I also know that the traditional church at one point was cutting edge and innovative to that generation. And if we're going to continue to march forward, we have to continue to innovate. So I want my generation to see that there is value in sometimes dimming the lights and all of that, but don't cut your spirit off when you see the old preacher walk up with a robe and doctor bars on his sleeve, and you hear that choir get up and you hear that Hammond organ, because God can move in that too. We didn't invent him. We did not discover God when we found acoustic guitars and learn how to sing songs about, deer running through fields and trees waving. All that's wonderful, but he's in the old school too. And I think that intergenerational conversation is going to be important. And that's what we try to instill in our people.
And you do that intentionally with your conference attendees and the upfronters that I would call them, and those who speak to those that are in attendance.
Absolutely. We're intentional because we understand that representation matters. And from a marketing standpoint, if I can just be very practical, I cannot expect people to come if they do not see themselves in the event. I think this is something that applies to our churches, our events, our conferences. People have to see themselves there and recognize that this is a safe space for me. If I spend my money on a flight, if I spend my money on a hotel, if I buy a registration ticket, if I take off work, hire babysitters, do whatever I need to do to come to this event, or even if I get out of my bed after working 6 days this week to come to a church on a Sunday morning, I need to know that I will be safe in that space. And that is accomplished through representation. That is accomplished by making sure you are intentional about showing people that there's room for them. It's fishing. It's soul winning in the most practical sense. It's branding. It's marketing. It's all of that. Whatever you want to put it, or however you want to spin it, people have to feel safe before they decide to show up.
I see, and I like that idea of the representation, each kind, because it kind of reminds me of the creation narrative, where
Yes, sir.
each kind reproduced after its kind.
After its own kind. Yes, sir.
And so if I have to have there, if I'm going to attract my kind and trying to get a effective ministry to multiple generations, then I have to present multiple generations, as you said, on the front row or on the platform, or the upfronters, to be a blended group, so that those that are that we're trying to reach can actually see themselves represented in the leader, leadership, and not just moving chairs and picking up after the church picnic, but literally involved in the church. And so, Pastor West, how do you integrate? They've sometimes been called emerging leaders into the leadership structure of your ministry.
Let me begin by picking up on something that Mark alluded to about the complaint that some younger pastors, or preachers, I should say, his peer group, make about pastors trying to hold them back, being jealous. things like that. I spent a lot of time around pastors and church leaders. And one of the things that you may want to remind your generation of is that I sit around with these men. I've never heard any of them in any way malign, demean, reduce, deject, any last one of them. I mean, I think sometimes one person feels like that they're echoing the sentiment for a generation of people. The people that I know spend so much time trying to help develop and mentor young men and women in ministry. That's one thing.
Yes, sir.
The second thing is to your question, uh, Dr. Dew, is the way that I've done it is that I've never had a tough time making adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, the sons of Issachar understood their times and knew what to do with them. And I probably, unlike Mark, didn't have a hard time making adjustments because if it's anything called blessed and luck, I'm both of them. I'm a one generation preacher.
Wow.
I come out of a strong preaching tradition, but I'm a one generation preacher. And many of the things that friends that I went to school with were exposed to didn't come to me until many years later.
Yeah.
So even in preaching, I became a late bloomer. And so my ministry has been baptized by so many people, uh, 40 years ago that took me in and gave me an opportunity. They preached me, they helped shape my thinking. They exposed me with what church is.
Yep.
So, so, I have a great debt
Mm-hmm.
to preachers, which is might be one of my motivations why I try to spend so much time with young preachers now to help them become what they believe God is calling them to become. And then the last thing I would say to uh, young preachers that may not be pastoring at this time. Number one, you don't wait to pastor to learn how to pastor. You start learning how to pastor in your interim.
Mm.
That is, you pay close attention to what's taking place in church if that's what you aspire to become one day. Another thing is that just because Reverend has gotten to be 50 don't mean he's going out to the pasture.
Right.
People wake up on Sunday morning to hear pastor preach.
Mhm.
And I learned that from, you probably remember him, Gerald, Dr. Claude Black. Claude Black pastored in San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah.
And Dr. Black was a Morehouse man, Mark, and an Andover Newton graduate back in the 40s.
Wow.
And he pastored in San Antonio, Texas. And I had him once to come speak to our preachers. And I'll never forget, he talked about when he was not pastoring, that the Lord convicted him when he thought he ought to be preaching on Sunday. He said the Lord just impressed on him reading the scripture, your calling is your chance. I love that. That your calling is your chance.
Yes, sir.
Yes, he said, so instead of me trying to preach in my pastor's place on Sunday, he would go down to where the soldiers were, down to the military base and where the place. They said he would just literally stand out at different places and preach.
And preach.
Today, you have so many opportunities to serve in churches.
Yes, sir.
Make yourself available. I guarantee you'll serve. Now, more specifically to your question, Gerald, how do I do it? I'm always scouting for young talent
Mm-hmm.
all the time. And I've been fortunate over the years to have some really sharp young talent. One way that I go about doing it is every summer I take in interns. I'll get 4 or 5 interns from different places, And some of them have been called up to come serve in our church, you know, and and have gone on to pastor from there. But I'm always looking for young talent with many gifts. You know, some of them I want strong preaching, but then others I want to be strong in education. One young man I'll never forget. I guess about 6 or 7 years ago, I had him in from Princeton, and that in his intern, I said, "What is the one recommendation you would make to us as a church?" He said, "Now this is about 7 years ago." He says, spent a lot of money preparing for, I can't remember if he said internet, but it was social media. That's what it was. Prepare for social media. I said, okay, I'll do that. And it turned out to be prophetic, what he said. Prophetic in the predictive sense, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
so the way that I do it, I scout around, even in my church now. When I see young people that I think possess talent and gift and skill to be developed for leaders, I pull them alongside of me and I start talking to them about ministry, you know. I preach about that, in fact, parents not telling their children that there's nothing to ministry. You know, I remember once when I went to college and I was asked, you know, it was asked, what are you majoring in? And my major was in philosophy of religion. And they said, well, what else you made? I said, that's all I got. They said, well, what if it failed? I said, I don't have a backup plan. You know, it's just God and Son. That's who I got to work for. If it failed, that's it. I don't have nothing else.
Wow.
So that's how I go about doing it. I'm looking for talent in every aspect of church, whether it's music, if it's media or ministry, whether it's with children or youth, with young adult men, whoever has that talent, I start trying to shape it, develop it, employ it, and then put it into practice in the church. You know, because you know, I'll give you one last thing. When and I know this is coming up, and I'll just jump the gun. When the pandemic hit and people was debating whether or not to suspend church, there were a lot of churches that lacked the resources to have strong media presence, and so they thought that, you know, well, Wes, we don't have television cameras, we don't have this and this. So I got a group of pastors together with a young girl in my church, and who showed them how to do this. Say, you got a phone? She said, you got a phone? Say, yeah. She said, well, you can go live on phone. But beyond that, this is what I challenged them to do. I said, I'll never get about 12 pastors on the line. I said, do you have teams in your church? I mean, do you have like people that's 13, 14, 15 in your church? They said, all said yes. I said, your problem is resolved. It's solved right now.
Yeah.
Tell them right now what you're debating with. Just go right to them and say, I need a television station. And I said, and I guarantee you, without making any fuss, they will have you live. And sure enough, that's who did it. So when you talk about looking for one of the most overlooked resources in the church is these 13, 14, 15-year-olds.
Yeah.
I make them go into the media room and put them in. And what I tell them is this: you can have a job doing this. This is a real job. One of my favorite young ladies in my church, she wanted an intern. Nobody wanted to bring on the intern. So and I said, well, what do you do? She said, media. I said, come work for me. And so she came to work for me. And while she was working, somebody sees her in the media doing the commercials on Sunday. And now she's at CBS. You get my point. You
Yeah,
see?
I get your point. I get your point.
Yeah. So that's how I go about doing it. Go find them, gather them, and okay, they may tab some stuff. That's what make church good for me. They disruptive, and you know, they want to put something up, and you're like, I don't know. And as you can tell, I stay in my domain. I don't know nothing about that. I just tell them this is what I want. And they'll say, oh, you're talking about this, 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 and this. So consequently, they think I'm like the sharpest, you know, man, Wes, he is on top of it. You asked me to explain it. I don't even know. I don't know. I just asked them the other week, what do you call this? They had all these pictures going simultaneously, and they named what the board was. I said, yeah, that looks nice. I said, my brain doesn't function like that, but that's how I go about doing it. And I'm speaking to those who are listening, to sit down and this. I know this is Congress and young people.
Mhm.
I would get them young people right now. Even if I'm live and say, I would just say, come help me do it. Those kids are coming there and do that, and they'll take media, out. Man, they'll take that media up to the limit. So people think I know what I'm doing all the time. I got them young people around me. They doing that stuff, man. They even answer all of my what do you do when you're sending out messages? I shouldn't do this because people listening are like, Wes is one of my friends. I shouldn't even tell them this. But I got kids who've been with me so long that when they answer this right, right on. Thumbs. Because they just say, well, we know how he would answer it.
Right.
But he was a sharp, man. I mean, that's our deep well of resource,
Yeah.
right? And but they got to be turned loose to do it, Now that goes back to validate what the young brothers then start criticizing, is to say, turn them loose and let them do it. And if they tear it up, it's okay. We can repair it, but let them do it,
Now, it's one thing, Pastor West and Elder Moore, for that lead pastor or that strategic person in leadership to have that kind of heart to do recruiting, to reach out, to develop people, to draw people close to them. But how do you build a culture of that mindset in your congregation? Because if you're the only one recruiting and drawing in, then they run into, brother and sister negativity and officer, we've never done it that way before, and brother, it costs too much, you need to go somewhere and sit down, or you just got here. I mean, how do you build a culture where the majority or the key leadership at least understand the value of recruiting and developing from within?
That's a great question. I'm gonna weigh in and I'm gonna get out the way so that the quick brain can come behind. But I know enough to know this. You shape culture by two things, and the first thing is you shape culture by what you celebrate. And so anything that you want to see more of, whether it be your church, your organization, your business, anything that you want to see more of, celebrate. So, for example, if we're talking about, let's say very practical, we're talking about punctuality. You're tired of church always starting late, choir members coming in with their robe over their arm, looking like we started early or something. You want to break that? Do it as you start celebrating those that were there early. And I promise you, this works across cultural lines, across age lines. Everybody likes to be celebrated. And so the first thing you do, whatever you want to see more of, celebrate. But here's the second way that we shape culture. The second way that we shape culture is not just by what we celebrate, but also by what we choose to tolerate. Anything that continues to go on that is outside of your vision, outside of your desired effect, outside of what you want to see, that you don't confront, that you don't address, that you don't speak to, that you don't at least raise for consideration, will continue to exist and it will continue to grow. And the message that you're sending to the new people that are coming in, to those that are still trying to find their way, is that this is okay. This is acceptable because we have chosen to tolerate it. And so you shape, one more time, you shape culture by what you celebrate. And if you want to see more of it, celebrate it. But also at the same time, you shape culture by what you choose to tolerate. And what you tolerate, you will also see more of. So that's my 2 cents. Now let me get my notepad out because I want to hear what Wes is going to say.
No,
So,
I agree with Mark on that. I would say it different. I mean, his is much more eloquent than mine, but I would agree with that. You model it. That would be my word. That same thing as celebration. You model it.
Yeah.
You sit there. I'll address the other side then, where you talk about when they run into a brother negative and sister don't want to be bothered. People become territorial in church. It's amazing to me. I used to always say in our church when we were young and we felt like we could just take on the world. And man, I mean, just think we were in our 20s and it was nothing we didn't believe that we could do. 20s and early 30s. Oh my goodness, man. I mean, you were still in Houston during that time.
Yeah.
It's like, my goodness, man, what are they doing out there? And you and I, we didn't build our church on ever referring to, the old church tradition and what they don't. We never tolerated that in our church. You couldn't talk like that. It was just that we was young and vivacious and energetic, and so we began to model what we wanted to do. Like when you talk about timeliness, we made a commitment that time was a moral issue, redeeming the time for the day is evil. And we made time a moral issue, that we were responsible for the time that God entrusted to us, that we ought to be stewards of God's time.
Wow.
And for 32 years, you come out now, and they would tell you, say, man, like people say, well, I'm going to get in for this part. They said, look, church start on the hour. They're probably going to start 5 minutes before.
Uh-huh.
And if you get in there 15 minutes after, you may have missed half the church service this morning, because Wes going to be up preaching at 20 minutes after that hour. And if we haven't shown enough stomp down church, we might be 25 minutes. So you model it, I mean, you do it. In your terminology, you celebrate it, And in my case, I would just say you model it. Now, to adjust that attitude of people there does come a time, and this is for caution for those that are listening as pastoring and you're new in your church. I'm always careful to say what I'm about to say, because I don't want you to go back and do it today and then you be churchless in the morning.
Right.
But once you garner enough influence, you have to put in some kind of place where people that are disruptive to the vision of your church cannot last in that environment.
Yes, sir.
You just cannot do that. I don't know about anybody else. I can't afford to lose one member. I need every last one of them that the Lord has entrusted to me. And I certainly don't need to lose them behind somebody saying, this is my ministry. So, from the very beginning, we put in, you serve 2 years and that's it. Now, if you go longer than 2 years, it's because we allowed that to happen with you. But at that point, 2 years is you'll start changing it out. Again, as good as that sound, it can be very disruptive when you get new people, especially if you're following somebody who's done an exemplary job. So what do we want them to do? To start discipling people on day one, or who's going to be the next person to follow you.
Yeah.
Because I don't care how long they stay there and how nice they are. They stay in a position too long, they begin to think that they own that position.
Wow.
They can be very, very rude about that position. So the way that I handle that, just model it, and then make sure you keep things in motion where you can move people when they need to be gone. And you can't be afraid to move people. I hear that a lot of times. But again, I say this with caution, because for those of you that don't know, the reason why I'm in the church I'm in now, because I was kicked out the church. I was put out for the very things I'm talking about right now. That's why I said, be careful. They put me out, and like we're not putting up with this, because they have been there much longer than me. And again, my downside was I was a one generation preacher.
Yeah.
So I felt like every church was supposed to function like my home church. Pastor said it, you did it. I later found out that's not the way that.
You got a new revelation.
Yeah, you got to have some influence. There you go. You got to have some influence, man. But influence sometimes comes by time. How much time have you been in that place?
Right.
So listeners say, yeah. So you say, I'm gonna change them in the morning and say, hold up now. Let me put a caution on that. If you don't have the influence to do it, you might not want to do it. And then you don't want to just do it to do it. Because sometimes we mistake people making statements to us as being against us versus them really trying to give wisdom to us,
Trying to caution us.
Not all the time are people against us,
Yes, sir.
And so you have a strong succession planning principle built in the fabric of your church. If the 2-year thing, or if you extend them, and you're always challenging those persons that are in
Yeah.
key positions of leadership to be developing persons to
Yeah.
succeed them, so that the baton is not dropped and everybody looks around who's going to pick it up, but it's actually passed to the next person,
Yeah.
and so that the momentum of the ministry is not lost. You can just keep till
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Lord says that's enough.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of shift because we dealt with multi-generational, we dealt with leadership as influence. I don't think we tapped into that pastoral piece
Mm.
and how we care for multiple generations and how we shepherd multiple generations. I think Pastor Mark talked about valuing everyone and everyone having a voice, and how important that is, because sometimes pastors can become, I guess, can have tunnel vision and
Mm.
only see certain segments of their congregation as valuable and important. Whereas there is a need to have the broader vision, to shepherd, the whole flock, as Paul tells the elders in Ephesus, to oversee all the flock over the which the Holy Ghost has made you overseer. So, kind of speak to that pastoral care piece, because the church mother is important, but that little child that just graduated kindergarten is important as well. The aging brother is important. The middle-aged man that's battling with a career and possibly aging parents or aging in-laws that he now has to bring into his home. And how do we effectively provide pastoral care that's shepherding to those multiple generations?
Mhm. Well, in my case, my son asked me once, he said, Daddy, do you still make hospital visits? I said, yes, if it's a crisis. I still make hospital visits when it becomes a crisis. On my desk, this person, I'm on my way. Other than that, I need to. James Harris in my church is over pastoral care. And I tried to make James Harris my assistant pastor, just based off because he had been with me that long. And he said these words to me. He said, Pastor, you have to know him. I'm not gonna imitate him right now, but he just said, I don't need a title to serve. I said, well, I understand that, James. He said, well, I don't need it. His dad was the long tenured pastor at Mount Pilgrim in Columbus, Georgia. In the heyday, that church it was thriving. He's the one that I think wrote, what is it, Traveling Shoes, or one of them songs. And his dad wanted him to succeed him. And man, let me tell you something. I said, Lord, if this man leave me, I'm gonna be in all kind of trouble. So he came to me. He said, at first he felt like maybe the Lord may be calling him to do that. His mother said, "You're at a church. You're at a good church, and you don't have this and that to contend with. You pray over that." And he did. And he said, "I know now God has put me where I want you, where He wants me." Let me tell you something. If James Harris had left that church to go to Columbus, I was going with him. Really is. That's how it is. I mean, it's his calling, and he does it. And he's shaping more people to join into that ministry to
Okay.
care. Because they know that I can't do all of that. And I mean, and when I look at the list of people that uh, come that way, I just saw somebody said, speak about women in leadership. And that is, for those that are listening, we have women in the pastoral care ministry who actually, and that's Cassandra Fair, who's the daughter of a pastor
Mhm.
and whose dad didn't embrace women in ministry.
Mm.
Before he closed his eyes and folded his tent, he just moved upstairs a couple of weeks ago. a couple of years ago, he invited her to be the guest preacher for his anniversary. So
Wow.
when you talk about James, you talk about Cassandra, you talk about Kenny, you think about Marco, you think about, man, you go on down the line, that's the group, not to mention the lay people that's involved in that pastoral care ministry.
Right.
If I didn't have them, I couldn't do it. I mean, so the phenomenon in our church for them, very seriously, is I love it when people send me a note and they said, I just never knew that being in a church this size that people could be that personable. So I say regularly, if somebody stand up in our church and say nobody called, nobody did this, I tell them, if nobody in this church called, it's because you didn't either you didn't tell anybody,
Yeah.
or you told somebody and you were relying on them to tell it and they didn't. Because in that church, I often said they'll tell you if any of them listening now, if they could send a note, they'll tell you. I always tell them, y'all too nice for me. They too nice for me. I mean, sometimes they so nice. I've watched those people care for folks. So that they nice. I believe that's the way that you go about it. You talk about the pastoral side to
Right.
echo Mark talks about everybody count. They're the group that makes sure everybody counts. I mean, everybody. Normally, by the time I get the note and call, they sound this way. I said, "This Pastor West." They'll say, "Yeah, so and so already called me. And they've done this, and thanks. Have a good day." That's
Yeah.
how they talk to me. I'm almost the part that I'm not calling these people no more. So that's it. So again, to those that are listening, I would sit down immediately. Like you got these deacons in your church. Man,
Right.
how would them say, no, you go to the hospital. Tell me anybody can sit down and argue about changing a lock, spending money, put some energy in the ministry,
Right.
go pray for people that's hurt. It'll change the way that they look at the church.
Yeah, that's it.
I ain't mean to hijack
Mhm.
that, but that's the one area that's done very well in the pastoral care.
Great. Thanks so much. Pastor Moore, kind of speak to, from your perspective, that leadership role, the value of women in a leadership role, and the perspectives that they sometimes can bring, that we as male leaders oftentimes just don't have the eyes to see it or the voice to speak to certain issues.
I think it speaks to just the blessing of the diversity of God's creation. I think that the role and the impact and the perspective of women in ministry, women in leadership, token representation. It's about giving real, authentic voice and equal input. And I think that it's going to be essential that men in leadership recognize that as great as we are, as anointed as we may be, as much weight and influence that God has placed on us, we don't see everything. We don't feel everything the same way. And if we're really going to be effective and maximize our impact, we need to have women in leadership on every level. And I think that their leadership needs to be celebrated. It needs to be applauded. And I think that this is a necessary conversation for right now, because if we're going to be back to what we talked about with representation and really just making sure people see themselves, if we're going to reach a new wave of educated, godly, anointed women, we have to show and make sure that it's clear that there's space for those voices to be heard. And so I think it's absolutely necessary.
I think in some sections, of our country and in some sections even of Christian life and thought, the conversation about women in ministry may be as difficult a conversation as the conversation of systemic racism is for white America in this particular time, and what courage it will take, for church leaders to even engage in those difficult conversations. Um, I'm not sure, Pastor West, if can the academy come alongside the local church and give voice to value of women in ministry, and maybe even give tools to a pastor that may be struggling to communicate that value that women in leadership and ministry can add.
Yeah, I think so. And I think in some regard, I've done that. Unfortunately, it's been the opposite effect also, that in our academy, our theological seminaries, they've promoted the reduction of women in church and ministry. So yes, I think that our academy, our theological seminaries, our divinity schools, our Bible colleges can pull aside of churches and help encourage women in ministry. That was always, I never had an issue with women in ministry. I remember, again, growing up, and so women were not allowed to preach and all that. And I never get, when that subject came up to me and they asked me, I said, I just don't have an issue with it. And the church fathers said that the reason why I responded that way is because my mother had raised me, is that there was no father, so I would be more sensitive to a woman. I said, oh no. I said, no. I said, that's not it. I said, my mind is not based on any sociological or sociocultural reason. I mean, it, when I was a boy, I may not have said sociocultural, but I said, that's not the reason. I said, I remember reading that God created in his image and likeness. And for me, creation settled the issue for me.
Yeah.
And that was it. I mean, and that was my answer. There's nothing. Creation settled for me that God created in his image and likeness, the Imago Dei. And if he could do that, then he could have the last word. And I grew up forever listening to preachers talk about sovereignty. God can do whatever he want to do, whenever he want to do it, whether you ask it, without your permission. And then I'm sitting down saying, yeah, but apparently God needs your permission for women in church.
Yeah.
And I mean, I got some ladies in my church who are preachers, and Deborah Minor, or Bell now. Deborah Bell is one. There's a lot of them. Aisha, man, who she's gonna be a little scholar, and that's an older lady, Sheila Williams, and when she preaches, I always weep for one reason. I said, Lord, look at what the church missed. Not giving this woman an opportunity to pray. Man, when I tell you this lady got the gift, man, I mean, she's a lady.
Mhm.
And her insight into scripture, her ability to communicate, her gestures, man. I
Mhm.
mean, she's like Reverend Sockman was to Harry Emerson Fosdick when he asked Fosdick about Sockman. Harry said, it wasn't nothing I could teach him. It ain't He's never been that good. And that's how I feel about her. She's actually that good, man. That, I mean, her insight, I was like, Lord have mercy.
Mhm.
And whenever I hear her preach, I say, boy, we lost a great gift. You want to know how many gifts the church has missed out on with women
Yeah.
because we said women not supposed to preach. I tell you, the condition we in now, we need everybody preaching right now.
You're right.
Not everybody.
You're
Tell
right.
Everybody.
the last story about that is one of my friends who went on to build a great church, and his mother-in-law was a preacher, and they just bumped heads. He just could not embrace it. Well, she didn't preach in the pulpit. She preached in a prison, and he was just telling me I'll never get one Sunday, and telling me why he disagreed with it and why uh, it wasn't theological, it wasn't biblical. I said, well, why don't you go be the chaplain at the women's facility? And this was his answer: whether you have to be a woman to be the chaplain. Yeah, there you go.
Well,
I just said, man, I got to go to my room, man.
yeah, I know you did.
Uh, and later on, he said, when I heard myself, I was ashamed of myself. I said, yeah. He did. I said, what? He said, you have to be a woman to fill that position. I'm like, wow. I said, so the correction system had more theological insight
Yeah.
than we did as a church.
Then he did. Yeah.
So it kind of converted that way. And I don't try to do a big fight about it. On our board by C3, Cynthia Hale is the chairman. And I said, Cynthia Hale, not the chairman because we needed a woman. We needed the best person who could lead a group of us. And she was the one who did it. And she does it. I mean, if it was left to me and somebody else, we never would get anything done. So hopefully we can put to rest that. But as you said in asking the question, man, that's a battle line, though. That for us talking about it so gently, man, it's some guys, they fight about that. I mean,
yeah, they're rooted. They're rooted.
Yeah,
and so I wanted.
you're not invited to preach for them and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, man, it's terrible. Be free, brothers. Be free. Be free.
Yeah. I wanted to circle back to Mark because a part of his conference deals with entrepreneurs and the marketplace and that kind of thing. What kind of encouragement do you give to the young sisters that comes to your leadership conference who may feel that they have a glass ceiling, and that corporate America or maybe even parachurch organizations and ministries will only let them go so far?
Really, I think that the greatest encouragement that we give is providing them with examples that show that the glass ceilings can be broken. And so in our programming, one of our biggest gifts is our speaker lineup, Doctor, because we're very intentional about bringing in voices that are qualified and uniquely positioned to speak to the places we want our attendees to be able to go. So we bring in an Ivy McGregor, who is in charge, I believe, spent time in Houston. She's in charge of Beyonce's nonprofit foundation. She works with Oprah, some of everybody, and she has shattered all kinds of ceilings. We bring in the Priscilla Shires, and we bring in women from the political side, Meredith Lilly and Dewana Thompson, who are doing things in government, and we're working in the Obama administration. We bring in women from different age groups that have done things that have set and blazed a trail so that our attendees, our sisters that come, who might have entrepreneurial aspirations or ministry aspirations, or whatever their particular lane might be, we're very intentional about putting examples in front of them that show you can do whatever you want to do. Let's show you some sisters that did it. And even on the ministry side, we made the tough decision. And I echo what Dr. West said, and even what you alluded to in framing the question, that this is a very sensitive subject, specifically about women in ministry, because as a young conference, we were doing, I think maybe 300 people. We made the decision to incorporate. We heard the voices of our attendees, and we had a lot of women in ministry that were coming, and they said, we want something for us. And so we made the decision to craft an entire women in ministry track at the conference, where we talked about all of the relevant ministry issues and subjects, but from a female perspective. And I thought we were doing the right thing, and then we did it, and then we got complaints because they said y'all are being sexist because you won't let the women in the regular preachers tracks. And we said, no, that's not it at all. They can go wherever they want to go. And so we've had to kind of navigate those waters. But the biggest thing that we try to do is make sure there's representation there, not just token representation, not just somebody to say we filled out a flyer and the rows on the flyer are balanced. No, but people that have the story to tell, people that have the credibility and can show our attendees that you can break through this because we broke through this. And so we've received tremendous feedback and tremendous results from our sisters in business, my sisters in ministry, my sisters in industry, that part of what they needed was, number one, seeing the speakers and the front stage people, but also back to the culture piece, being in the community of other forward thinking, open minded, driven to succeed kind of people. I don't think we do enough justice to the whole idea of just environment. Something magical happens when you put people of like minds, like faith, like drive in one place. And one of the gifts that we like to offer is, yes, the speakers, and yes, the representation from the front stage, but also the promise that you don't know who's going to be sitting next to you that's going to add fuel to your fire, that's going to push you and encourage you. So it's really about creating environment, and that's by what they see on stage and by who they see sitting next to them. So that's my contribution to the conversation, putting them in position to see it. We can talk about it all day. We can say it's possible all day. But when you put someone in proximity to see and touch and ask questions of and glean from and receive, impartation and teaching from, that's, in my opinion, when progress is really made.
Very good. Thank you so much. I need to, since time is a moral issue, Dr. Ralph West. Yeah. Tanner, how much more time do we have for our session? About 10 more minutes. Okay, very good. Because we did deal with multi-generation. We talked about pastoral leadership. We really didn't touch on strategic vision or strategy or planning. And I understand from my perspective, you need God's involvement, but you also need human instrumentality. Therein lies the need for a strategic plan. And can you all kind of speak to the planning processes that you go through in order to realize the vision that God has given to you as you inspire and influence the multiple generations to kind of come alongside you? How do you set up your plan? How do you plan vision fulfillment?
I defer to Dr. West.
Well, one of the things we did is that we hired a consultant that focuses in on vision casting. And we sat in the room and he asked us about 100 questions. And, and again, I think out of my right side of my brain, so you have to force me to sit down and to think strategically. So after all day talking and coming up with a list of words, interestingly, we came up with a word that I didn't tell him, he didn't tell me, and I told Barbara. And when we finished, uh, we put the words on the table, and this word and my word were the same word. His was leaping, mine was leap. And so leading, evangelizing, assimilating, and proclaiming. So that became the vision of our church, born out of what we do: leading, evangelizing, assimilating, and proclaiming. And so leading, as we talk about leadership today, assimilating, that is getting people involved in ministry, uh, assimilating, evangelizing rather, winning people, getting them involved and proclaiming, telling the story. So that became the word that kind of described us. But the process that we went through was to sit down with people and at a table and talk all day and just throwing everything out. What do we like? What do we do? What are we known for? Who are we? Where do you think God's leading us? And so we started taking all these words and going through the words and said, would you say this word is this? We put them under captions, and they all came under, leading, evangelizing, stimulating. So to answer the question, how do we go about it, is to sit down and think strategic. And of course, that means where are we trying to go? One of my favorite tales is Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown always hit his mark. He never missed, not one time. Because Charlie would shoot his arrow wherever it landed, he would go put a red circle around it. Yeah. And that's the way a lot of churches do ministry. So when people start saying, there's no genius to it, I want to go here, And the last thing I would say to people that's listening about vision is that let the vision drive the vision. And what I mean by that is people want us to do a lot of things. We're called on to do a lot of things. And so, the vision, that's the picture. The mission is the fuel. Or you could say the vision is the vehicle, but the mission is the fuel. So what drives the vision are these words. Church Without Walls is committed reaching men and women who do not have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and bringing them in a personal relationship with Him and in a responsible church membership. How do we do it? We enrich people, evangelize persons, equip believers, and edify mission. So when you lay that on the table and you come to our church and the Lord has given you this grand vision to do something, we want to know two things, and that's simply this. Will it strengthen our relationship with Jesus Christ? And will it make them a responsible person? If you say no to that, then we know that's not who we are. And we've had a lot of people tell us what we ought to do and we ought to be doing. And I tell them, said, that's not who we are. That's not who we are. And churches have to be bold enough to stand on who they are. The only reason why a lot of churches get derailed is they're trying to do everything that everybody else is doing. Yeah. Know who you are and be who you are.
Know your calling and stick to it. Don't engage in what is called mission drift, where you drift from what your true calling is. Listen, brothers, we need to try to wrap this up. I want to give you all a couple of minutes just to give some closing thoughts. The Father's Day is coming. Pandemic is still here. Black Lives Matter. Racism, the racism conversation. And then in the midst of all of this, we have to encourage people of God, and then those who are far from God, lead them closer to God. So any closing thoughts on any of these things that you want to share with our listeners?
I would say, number one, again, what an honor it is to be in this forum, and special thanks, of course, to the RH Board family for having the insight and the vision to host this visionary conference. And with that being said, I think that we cannot lose sight of the fact in these extremely troubling times where, as you mentioned so eloquently, Dr. D, we're fighting so many pandemics at once. Yes, the novel COVID-19, which we've been fighting since. This is a lot of pressure. This is a lot of anxiety producing things going on at once. Every time you cut on the news, it seems to be something bad. It seems to be something negative. But I think that it's important in these times, now more than ever, that we remember who we are. And as the people of God, I think it's important that we remember that we are standing on a promise, that we are standing on His word, and we have a guarantee through Scripture, that even in this, we need to choose to believe. We need to choose to believe that there will be glory after this. And so I would simply say it's not Greek, it's not Hebrew, but it's honest. Let us remember who our help comes from. And let's stay encouraged. Let's stay focused. And in this vision conference, let's remind ourselves of the fact that if God has given us a vision for the future, if God has given us a vision for our businesses or our ministries or our companies, keep in mind, He would not have given us a vision for the future if the future did not exist. So even in this, we will get through it. We will survive. We will come out victorious. God is on our side.
Thank you. Mr. West?
Be not dismayed, whatever betide. God will take care of you. Beneath His wings, His love abides. God will take care of you.
Amen. That's a great word to close on. Gentlemen, I thank God for you, for your wisdom, your time, your investment in this conference and into the listening audience. And I just appreciate our time together on tonight. And I just want to give a closing blessing upon you and our listening audience. God, our Father, we thank you for our time together. We thank you for the inspiration of your Holy Spirit and the information that we have shared here today. Bless the remaining presentations of our Vision Conference on tomorrow, Juneteenth. God, and Freddie Haynes will be sharing through this medium, God. And we just ask that you would protect us, guide us, lead us, continue to give us your favor as we go forward in faith. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.